So today, we're going to dive into the mind of a man who looked at the modern world and saw a profound spiritual crisis. His name was Joseph Ratzinger, who you probably know as Pope Benedict XVI. He saw our time as one of deep insecurity, a kind of emptiness really, and he offered a very specific prescription. So let's explore his diagnosis and the incredible hope he believed could be found right in the middle of it all. But before we get into all that, let's just start with a question that gets right to the heart of his concern. What actually happens when an entire society starts to lose its grip on hope? When all the old answers don't seem to work anymore and we're all just left feeling adrift. For Ratzinger, this wasn't some abstract idea. He had this powerful metaphor to describe our era. He called it a large holy Saturday. Now think about that. That's the day between the crucifixion and the resurrection. A day of absolute profound silence, where God seems completely and utterly absent from the world. And you can just feel how deep this goes for him. He wasn't just talking about some spiritual desert, He saw it everywhere, in poverty, in the ache of loneliness, in broken relationships. It's this massive inner desert where people are just no longer aware of their own dignity or even what the point of life is. Okay, so before we can even talk about a cure, we've got to really understand the diagnosis. What exactly did Ratzinger see as the core symptoms of this modern crisis of faith? Well, he zeroed in on three big ones. First, the obvious thing, a huge decline in religious practice, right? Just a growing indifference. But that was connected to something even deeper, a crisis of truth itself. This idea that we've started to give up on the belief that we can actually know what's true. And, well, the result of all that, the person of Jesus Christ starts to fade from the center of how we see history and even our own lives.
Ratzinger didn't think this just popped up out of nowhere. He traced its roots back for centuries and pointed a finger at the Enlightenment, or Aufklärung in German. Now, it championed reason, for sure, but he argued it also kicked off this process of desacralization, basically pushing faith out of public life and locking it away in the private sphere.
And this really brings us to a fundamental split in how people think, one that was central for Ratzinger. He saw this modern tendency to look at the church as just another human organization, an instrument that we can tinker with and reorganize whenever we want. But he argued that this misses the entire point, that its true essence is a supernatural mystery, a divine gift that you can't just redesign to fit the latest trends. But these ideas didn't just come from a library. To really get what he's saying, you kind of have to get him. We have to look at the forces that shaped the man, especially his early life in a Germany that was falling under the spell of a dark and absolute tyranny. His whole way of thinking was forged in the fire of his family's unwavering opposition to National Socialism. Right from a young age, he saw firsthand the ugliness of a political power that demanded total control and viewed Christianity as its mortal enemy. And this wasn't just some quiet intellectual thing. He tells this amazing family story about his aunt that just captures their spirit perfectly. Whenever a train carrying some top Nazi official would speed past their home, she and others would run out and make this gesture of contempt at them. It's a small act of defiance, sure, but man, it just speaks volumes about the spirit of resistance he grew up in.
You look at who he was reading, it all makes sense. He was drawn to thinkers who focused on the personal, the relational. People like St. Augustine with his intense focus on the inner journey of faith, and the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, whose whole thing was the I-thou encounter. That's this idea that we relate to God not as an it, some abstract system or set of rules, but as a you, in a real, direct, and personal relationship.
Okay, so we've got the diagnosis, a world in a spiritual desert. And we've got the man, a thinker shaped by the fight against tyranny. So what was his prescription? How do we actually find a way out of this desert?
He basically laid out a three-part path. For faith to really live and breathe today, he said it has to be built on three pillars: manifestation, knowledge, and fulfillment. Let's break down what he meant by each of those. First up, manifestation. Ratzinger's point was, stop looking for fireworks. Stop waiting for some grand, pompous sign from God. Instead, faith is about recognizing a hidden sign, finding an obscure God right in the middle of ordinary, everyday moments. Think about the shepherds. They didn't find a king in a palace. They found a baby in a feeding trough. That's the idea. Second, knowledge. And listen, when he says knowledge, he is not talking about passing a test or memorizing doctrines. For Ratzinger, real knowledge in faith is all about relationship. It's a growing friendship with Christ. It's the kind of knowing that comes from spending time with someone, not from studying a textbook about them.
And third, fulfillment. Now this is where it gets really counterintuitive for a lot of us.
He argues that the biggest temptation for modern Christians isn't some deep philosophical doubt. It's the feeling that Christianity is just impractical, that it doesn't actually deliver a better life. But Ratzinger says true fulfillment isn't about getting a life free from burdens.
And that's the absolute game changer here. Christian hope isn't a promise that you'll have a life free from pain or anxiety or loss. It's the promise that you are never, ever alone in those burdens because God himself has entered right into the human mess with you.
And all of this brings us full circle, right back to that stark, powerful image we started with, Holy Saturday, the day of God's silence. He brings up that incredible scene from the Gospels. Jesus is fast asleep in the boat while this massive storm is raging, and his disciples are panicking for their lives. Ratzinger says this just perfectly captures the modern feeling. God sleeps while his affairs are about to sink. It's that feeling that we're out here struggling against the waves, and God is just gone, absent.
But here's the twist, and this is everything for Ratzinger. This silence, this feeling of God's absence, it's not the end of the story. It is not a sign of ultimate despair. Instead, it's the necessary darkness that comes right before the dawn. It's the quiet tomb that comes right before the resurrection.
And this is really the heart of his message. That it's precisely in the darkest mystery, in the deafening silence of Holy Saturday, that we find the brightest sign of a hope that is truly without limits. The experience of God's absence is what prepares us for the reality of his presence.
So it kind of leaves us with a question for our own crazy, noisy lives, right? What if the most profound answers we're looking for aren't found in shouting louder, but in finally learning how to listen in the silence?